Okay? You okay? Can people hear? Oh, there we go. Now I can hear that it's working. Welcome to this session, everybody, on drug-resistant infections and vaccines. Now, I realize that we are coming towards the end of what for many of you has been a very intense couple of days, and you're probably all feeling a little bit, I don't know, your brains must be exploding from all the information that you've been given. Please keep going for this one last session, and we're looking forward to getting some interaction with you and some questions for our panel that we can discuss, because this is a fantastically important issue. We know, of course, from all our history lessons when we were at school, that in the olden days, people used to die from all sorts of things, such as minor cuts and scratches that became infected, TB, massive issue, minor infections which turn into major epidemics. And we've put all that past us, haven't we? That we've got modern medicine and these things are things of the past. But of course, that's not really the case. We rely hugely on a few drugs for many, many things. For modern medicine is often based upon just these few drugs. For example, I mean, just recently I was thinking about my own family. I have a daughter who recently had some elective surgery changing her jawline. I have one of my best friends who's just had a hip replacement, and I have an aunt who's currently having chemotherapy for breast cancer. None of those things are really sensible unless we actually have some basic antibiotics which stop people from getting infections. If we don't have those antibiotics, all those aspects of modern medicine no longer seem sensible. They no longer make sense. And that's quite something. I mean, if you actually think about how many lives, how many years of our lives are dependent on having that modern medicine, well, there's an estimate out there that life expectancy at the moment in OECD countries is about 80. Without antibiotics, it would be about 60. It's an enormously important issue that we keep our antibiotics and other related antipathogens working properly. And the problem is that they won't forever. We know that. There's this annoying thing called evolution and natural selection. And as soon as we try and as soon as we have a drug which kills the nasty bugs, the bugs are trying to evolve in order to avoid being killed. And so effectively, the more that we pump drugs into our bodies, into animals' bodies, the more that we spray them on crops, or the more that they leak into the environment in the manufacturing process, the more chances the drugs have to evolve, and the shorter period of time that we'll have when those drugs are effective before natural selection and evolution means that they're no longer effective. So we're in a race. We're in a race between our ability to generate new treatments, new drugs, and evolution. And at the moment, frankly, we're not winning that race. So that's the broad outline of where we are in talking about drug-resistant infections and why it's so unbelievably important. We have a panel today to discuss this, fantastic panel representing various different viewpoints in the debate. So we have, starting to my left, we have Julie Gerberding, who is Executive Vice President and Chief Patients Officer at MSD. And that's a really interesting and an important company, because unlike most big pharmaceutical companies, they're still investing in trying to develop new antibiotics, and they have a big vaccine program as well. Julie's maybe even more interesting because before joining MSD, she was also director of the US Center for Disease Control, CDC, where she led the agency through more than 40 public health crises. Next, we have Tim Jinks, who's head of drug-resistant infections program at Wellcome, which is the Wellcome Trust is a huge funder of research in the pharmaceutical sector, and Wellcome and Tim are hugely important in the fight against antimicrobial resistance. They fund new research and have fantastic ideas like the Longitude Prize, which is a big reward if anybody invents new ways of diagnosing whether diseases need to be treated with antibiotics or not. And the third member of our panel is Serhiy Kirill, who's a member of parliament from the Ukraine. And Ukraine has a particular problem with drug-resistant tuberculosis. And Mr. Kiral's been trying to raise the profile of this problem, both within the Ukrainian parliament and within the Ukraine, but also within the Interparliamentary TB Caucus, which works across the world. And in particular, he wrote reports for the Council of Europe on drug-resistant tuberculosis and what should be done to tackle it. So a great panel. So I think we should immediately get started, because we don't have that long this afternoon. And the first thing really I want to talk about is the lack of urgency in our efforts to address AMR. But before we do that, or rather whilst we start thinking about the answers to that question, I should talk about BCAST. Now, those of you who've been here for a while should know how BCAST works. Do you? Are there people who have not yet heard the pitch for using BCAST and how you go on to www.bcast.live/OECD4, and then you can put in questions to ask the panel at any point during this panel this afternoon. But before we do that, you can also use that in order to be able to vote online. So could we call up, just to make sure this is working, our first question? There you go. It's a question about how many people in this not very representative audience, but still worth trying to ask the question. How many of you know what antimicrobial resistance is, and that it could make routine hospital procedures life-threatening in the future? Let's see how that comes up. Nobody is voting at all, or else the technology isn't working. It's 100% knows about it. The fact that there's only one person, oh no, there we go. It's working well. Good. Well, panel, whilst that is playing out and the answers are coming through, let me turn to you about that question. Do you think that there's enough urgency in our discussions about antimicrobial resistance? Serhii, why don't I start with you? You're the MP. You're supposed to know about what public opinion.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I'm really pleased to be here in such a respectable audience in Paris, in OECD. I'm here on behalf of the Global TB Caucus, and the fact I am part of the Global TB Caucus, not being a doctor, and my involvement also with the Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly report proves that it is some sort of a matter of emergency. The Council of Europe picked up this topic with the motion which was tabled about 3 years ago, and the report with the resolution calling on 47 member states of the Council of Europe to take urgent measures in tackling AMR, particularly tuberculosis in Europe, was adopted last April. And I think last year was particularly critical to raising awareness, and particularly on the political level, on the highest political level, to the AMR and tuberculosis, because in September we had this high-level meeting in the United Nations with the political declaration adopted to all the global community asking for action to take the urgent measures to tackle the problem. I think there have been a lot of reports recently about that. There is a quite new and fresh report just published by The Economist, which shows how AMR and tuberculosis can also have a significant impact on economic growth, which is quite relevant to all the OECD member states and the organization in particular. And I'm really happy to see that this public health issue, particularly AMR, is brought up within this forum, which you might think should not be here or is not relevant to the subject. I think most of the partners and stakeholders in TB would like to see more non-TB or non-AMR people, like non-professionals, get involved, so that the information and the awareness is spread all over the place. It is an urgency if you look at the statistics, and it does require not simply the awareness or discussions, but does require active measures cross-border and also on the national level. That's why I am involved. That's why the Global TB Caucus is so active in that area.
So just to follow up on one particular issue, because When I look at some of the other disease areas that are high on the political agenda, they often have a very, very active lobby in the civil society area. When I think of malaria, for example, or HIV/AIDS, even dementia, I'm not sure that we have the same for drug-resistant infections. I mean, what do you think? Do you think this is important? What can we do about it?
I agree completely, and as a parliamentarian, I can say that the policymakers, the parliamentarians, those who are actually adopting the budgets and adopting policies that are being brought to them by the government, have been for a large period of time neglected, underestimated, not involved, not engaged. Even in the recent report submitted to the Secretary General of the United Nations on AMR, the parliamentarian, the policy level, the parliamentarian level was completely not taken into account. So there were not measures or solutions crafted or tailored to parliamentarians, sorts of kind of recommendations, what they should do, what kind of work needs to be done by them to get involved and to be part of that. Take my own example. I have 2 years ago I established the parliamentary caucus in Ukrainian parliament, and throughout that period we managed to turn ourselves into the platform where we get all the stakeholders on board in Ukraine, from the ministry, from the executive, the civil society, which is becoming really vibrant and extremely active, critical to ensure sustainability, good expertise, but also follow up on many of the policy measures. Also, international community, we have a lot of donors that are funding, providing technical assistance to a number of projects, either pilot projects in different regions, in the healthcare reform, for example, sector and others. And we managed to be successful in that. So it's not only about the exchange of latest news, experience, but it's also about making good policies. Based on that, the government tabled a new TB program for the next 5 years, for example, to fight TB, which is not being currently debated in Ukrainian parliament. I know that across all the other 48 national caucuses that are part of the Global TB Caucus, there's similar work being done. It's more active work, and I think that that's where we can make the change, and it does need to be addressed in a proper way.
Very good. Well, thanks very much for that. Julie, may I ask you the same question? Do you think there's enough urgency from your point of view?
If you think about urgency in terms of, how do you measure it? If it's measured by the number of meetings and reports, then I would say it must be pretty urgent because there are lots and lots of those. If you measure urgency by actual action that has an impact, or meaningful investments and engagements that are turning the tide, then I'm not so sure we're feeling the urgency. And then finally, if you're thinking about it from the standpoint of individual people, until individual people understand that how they request and or use or abuse antibiotics matters to themselves and their families, their biome, but also their community and their environment, then I don't think we've come even close to appreciating the urgency.
Yeah, and we can see in our survey that we've done here with, as I say, definitely a biased audience in the statistical sense, seen as you're informed people involved in policy debate. Even so, we've got about a quarter of the respondents who didn't really know what antimicrobial resistance was, which says something in itself, because I think if we were talking about malaria, you wouldn't find a quarter of the people not knowing about it. And so we do seem to be missing something there, don't we? I'll come back to some more pointed questions in a moment, I think, to you. But let me move to Tim first. From your point of view, you go to all these endless meetings as well. I know I see you often at them, talking about antimicrobial resistance. So Julie's surely right. I mean, this has moved up the political agenda in some sense.
Well, indeed. And first of all, I think I'll echo what Julie said. I mean, there has been much discussion about this, but it's actually been within fairly closed communities. So I have cautious optimism that there is progress being made, but frankly, it's not with enough urgency and not enough real action is occurring. And one of the things that is particularly concerning is the fact that we have something that has a degree of high-level political engagement It was very nice to see that there has been a UN process that led to resolution followed by actions from the UN Interagency Coordination Group making the recommendations. And yet, there's no public mandate for this. There is a complete absence, really, of understanding at the level of civil society as to what is this issue, why should I care, what do I want to see to do with it. And this creates quite a difficult situation, particularly for political action. Now, it's not that I would expect everyone on the street to become expert in this otherwise esoteric topic of drug-resistant infections. This is something wonderfully interesting to microbiologists and infectious disease doctors, but it is a biological process that is undermining the healthcare system's capacity to maintain the level of safe healthcare delivery we have today, much less offer the opportunity of improving it. So we have to do something very urgently. We have to engage civil society. We need more of a public mandate as well to balance out what is happening so that we can have real action following from the nice words that we're getting at the political level.
Well, let me follow up with a very practical problem for all of you, which is that, as you know, it's extremely difficult to actually charge much for many of the drugs that we're talking about. And yet, if we're actually trying to control the number of people, the number of drugs that are used, then we have a real problem, because there seems to be very little incentive for anybody to actually develop a new drug. And we see this, unfortunately, in what's happening, not in MSD, I'll acknowledge that, but in many of the big pharmaceutical companies where they have withdrawn from developing relevant drugs in the drug-resistant area, especially antibiotics. What can we do about this?
Well, I can start. I think we can remember in the past when the pipelines were full of antibiotics, some innovative, some Me Too drugs, and they were widely advertised and widely prescribed, and so the volume of use was enormous, both in humans and in animals. And we have certainly recognized now that that is absolutely the wrong thing to do. So you cannot make the case for profitability on the basis of volume. You have to make it on the basis of value. We really need to think about these advanced antibiotics like orphan drugs. They should be used very sparingly and only for the patients that absolutely have a diagnosed need, which we'll get into the conversation about how we can make that diagnosis more rapidly. But unfortunately, then the business case doesn't work out. And we've seen both large and small companies simply drop out. Most recently, a small biotech company with an innovative approach just simply had to go out of business because they can't make the investors have confidence that there's a business case to stay in the game. So the pipeline is very thin. It takes a certain kind of business courage as well as, I think, a moral compass to stay in the game and believe that, as you said at the beginning, Mother Nature is very good at manufacturing drug resistance, and these drugs will be increasingly important. So we have to be there to try to have a line of protection, and at the same time, it's tough to stay in the development game.
I mean, Tim, you're very heavily involved in funding research. Does that research ever actually make it to market, given that it's not obvious that
Well, as I sit here today, I am deeply concerned about one of the strong pillars of our activity. We are co-funding an organization called CARB-X, which is an accelerator to support the early stage research and development for new products, particularly antibiotics. Right now, it's unclear that the graduates from this program, as they move through their clinical studies, have anywhere to go. So we have a situation where it's very clear that the economics does not add up. We have the business models that have been used in the past decades are not appropriate to be applied to how we want to reimburse, pay for antibiotics, as well as the diagnostics that should be used in terms of diagnosing those patients that should receive the antibiotics. So it's a very difficult problem that the standard business models or wrong. There was a period of debate of, well, is there really a market failure here? I think now it's very clear. The evidence is there. The market failure is very real. We have a pipeline of R&D for new antibiotics that's woefully inadequate for future needs. We have the problem now that resistance is increasing everywhere we look, and it will get much, much worse. And there's some small areas of hope, but overall that pipeline is not where it needs to be today. And that's with us stepping forward, putting lots of real money alongside our other partners, the U.S. government, the British government, the German government, as well as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And we are at risk now. So we need to see change in how the business model can work and how these things are paid for. The medical value is very obvious to us, but the economics doesn't recognize the medical value in a sensible way.
But how do we break the logjam? I mean, I've been involved in the G20 discussions on this over many years. It goes in the declaration. Everybody agrees this is a problem. Moving forward beyond those words to actually having some practical action, we've not made much progress at all.
Indeed, we have not. We've had some heated debates, and that's about it. But there are a couple of opportunities of hope that we can look at, and I'll get to that in a moment. But what is it we need? We think there should be appropriate forms of incentives that pay for new drugs that are licensed and available for use when necessary for them to be used. Now, the mechanisms for that are the areas where in the detail we get lots of heated discussion, but there should be appropriate incentives that pay for these drugs to be available when needed. And that's different than paying for it on a per-use basis. Now, the seeds of hope, if we look at the United Kingdom, they are considering a model that is kind of an insurance or a subscription type model that pays for access of innovative, newly licensed drugs to be available to the National Health Service. This is something that's been loosely described as the Netflix model. And so it would be a wonderful thing to see this implemented very soon and with enough investment effort that it's realistic to move forward to keep the private sector in this space. We need private sector participation for good. There needs to be a much clearer partnership across the public and private sector on this.
Well, that brings me on to say, because in TV, of course, there's been lots of discussions about public-private partnerships. Is this the way forward?
Yeah, definitely. And then just yesterday we took part in a meeting organized by the private sector, and we were very much actively engaged as the Global TB Caucus, but also the Stop TB Partnership was there, and the Global Fund director. There is no other way. We have to partner. If you look at TB, there are only two second-line new antibiotics invented just recently in the last 25 years, which is not now much celebrated. And I agree, it's the market failure. There has to be incentives. If you look at where there is the most need in these drugs, it's the high burden, so-called high burden countries. They are low income countries, so the capital is not there. The capital is in the developed countries, which actually do not see that urgent need, as you said. Then also, I think that the opportunities to look for some innovative or creative ideas in terms of financial instruments, like one of the investment fund yesterday was talking about so-called impact bonds. But then again, the governments have to be involved. The international community has to be also much active in backing that, in creating these incentives in order for the private sector to invest in innovation, in research and development. And there is quite a substantial gap right now in this investment. It's something like 1.3 billion, which is still missing in the research and development. This year is the critical year for the Global Fund, which is funding a lot of these programs. They are in the so-called next replenishment period. They hope to triple their budget, so maybe there will be some progress. We would like to see more money going into TB, which is still the largest single deadliest infection killer in the world. If you compare with Ebola, for example, everybody's talking about Ebola, and there's so money being channeled to Ebola. You were talking about that. 29,000 cases in 3 years, 11,000 deaths. Take TB, only drug-resistant TB, it's 350,000, and more than third people are dying from TB. 1/4 actually has a chance, so it's around 50% on average cure. In some countries it's even less, just because we do not have effective TB care vaccines or drugs available. So there is an urgent need, but I'm sure that we have to be creative, and we have to have governments, keep governments also on the national level accountable, so that they really put money into funding their TB programs.
Very good. Well, look, we should move on to some other topics. So if I could ask whether we could have the next question coming up on screen, please. Is that possible? I look up. No, it's, well, whilst they're preparing. Ah, there we go. Here's a question then for you in the audience. Do you know if your vaccine schedule is up to date? And whilst you're answering that, I'll turn to you, Julie, to say what's the link between vaccines and drug-resistant infections?
Well, we're talking about antimicrobial treatment, but of course, if we can avoid infection in the first place, we don't need the treatment. And I think we have seen with certain vaccines, like vaccines against pneumococcal pneumonia, where we have to hospitalize patients and they get treated with antibiotics, and then often they get secondary infections, so they need even more potent antibiotics, that one disease accounts for a tremendous amount of antimicrobial use and the pressure to select for the resistant organisms. So by vaccinating people against infections that would otherwise account for hospitalization and the need for broader spectrum drugs, we can really reduce the requirement for human health. And that certainly applies to influenza, because the major reason why people die from influenza is secondary bacterial pneumonia. So getting your influenza vaccine, getting your pneumococcal vaccine, etc., these are really important things. And of course, we also have vaccines in our pipeline to reduce future infections as they mature. But an even more important dimension of vaccines is how they might be used in animal health, because there are tons of antibiotics get poured into animals originally for growth promotion, which is largely abandoned, at least in Europe and in the developed world, but also for prophylaxis. When some animals in a herd become sick, it's easy to treat the whole herd. Much better if we can vaccinate the animals against these common infections in the first place and completely avoid that problem. I happen to work for a company that has both a human health and an animal health business. And while we've taken a One Health approach to what we do, we've really put energy into the animal vaccine domain. We actually have 400 animal health vaccines now, in an effort to try to reduce the requirement for using antibiotics there that would otherwise have value in human health. So it is part of the approach. It's not the solution to the resistance, but it certainly helps reduce the pressure for the emergence to accelerate or expand on a drug-by-drug basis.
Because incidentally, our audience is astonishingly virtuous. I wonder if I actually believe that 58% of people know that their vaccine schedule is up. I should say 58% of people think that they know that their vaccine schedule is up to date. That's not quite the same thing as it actually being up to date. But still, that's quite impressive. Even so, over 40% don't know. And I would put myself amongst that, actually. I have no idea. Tim, yeah, don't look at me like that. I feel bad enough. Tim, it is true, isn't it, that there's more antibiotics actually used in the livestock sector, in the farming sector, than there is in the human sector. So are vaccines the way forward? I mean, is this going to be the way that we can actually free up a little bit more space for the human health?
Oh, indeed, it is true that between 2/3 to 3/4 of antibiotic usage is in the agriculture and farming space versus human health. And that is something that would seem to be the incorrect balance. Now, we have to recognize that there is an important role for antibiotics to play in treating infection in animals, particularly for food security. But that's not to say that we shouldn't make very radically different approaches there. And yes, vaccines do have an important role. Now, the fact is that we're dealing with this complicated phenomenon, which will never be defeated, but can be managed. And vaccines are a key element of the multi-pronged approach that can help to reduce the pressure on our usage of antibiotics so that this resistance phenomenon becomes much less frequent. So critically important, it should be pursued as rapidly as possible alongside replenishing the pipeline of new antibiotics. And I do agree that the potential on the farming side is probably greatest due to some of the complexity in terms of the rollout and implementation of vaccines. You know, it is hard to, where we have, I'm actually impressed that 42% of the people are honest enough to say they don't think their schedule is up to date, because society's engagement with vaccines and vaccinations is curious and is under threat. We have an anti-vax movement now, which is actually meaning that people are participating less in being vaccinated and having their children vaccinated. And so the idea that we might roll out dozens more vaccines in the human health sector to solve this problem is very unrealistic. I think it's much more realistic that we can achieve long-term gains on the animal health side.
Well, let me now move to the audience to see if any of you have any questions. So you can either use this the BCAST technology, or just stick your hand up in the air and the microphone will come and see you. Does anybody have any question that they would like to ask the panel? Yep, there's one at the back there. Could we get a microphone there? Yep. If you could just introduce who you are and then ask the question. Thank you.
My name's Hannah Leckie. I work at the OECD in the Environment Directorate on water quality. You mentioned that vaccines are one part of the toolkit. What are some of the other, like say, top three from each of you, ways forward on how we can minimize AMR?
So, there are really four buckets. The first is to prevent infections in the first place, and that, again, is where vaccines and other preventive measures come into play. The second bucket, especially from a human and animal health perspective, is to be able to diagnose and treat infections when they occur quickly and accurately with the least broad drug possible. One of the downsides of the people who are concerned about AMR right now is that sometimes patients aren't getting the treatment they need in hospitals because everyone is afraid to use a broad-spectrum antibiotic, and sometimes the patients don't get the medicine they need because it takes too long for the laboratory to figure out that it's a drug-resistant form. So we've got to have innovative diagnostics, and we can do this at the bedside and know this patient needs this old-fashioned drug and this patient needs one of these special drugs. The third bucket is to reduce the spread from one person to another, and that's obviously very important in healthcare settings like hospitals and especially long-term care facilities. But it's also true at home and in schools and other places where people spread things around. And then I think lastly, and probably the hardest to implement, are the stewardship programs that really measure and monitor the use of antibiotics. We have governments or countries where prescriptions are not even required for these medicines, and so they are available to everyone, and that is certainly not what we want to see when we're trying to preserve very special drugs for very special purposes. So we've got to get control over prescribing in both human and animal health, and I think that's an area that requires the political action that our leader in that respect has been talking about. The last point I would make is that ultimately most of the genes that account for the complex drug resistance that we have today actually existed long before we had antibiotics. They're present in soil bacteria and fungi. And so we have to think of the whole environment, and that includes water and soil as other resources where resistance can emerge, resistant pathogens can emerge, but also as we add antibiotics to those ecosystems one way or another, that selects for the pre-existing resistance, and that creates a problem as well.
I don't know if either of you want to add anything. I will as well, but
So I just want to build on that, and one of the areas that hasn't gotten enough attention is the environmental dimension. And a further thing that Julie didn't mention is the importance of access throughout the world to effective treatments as well as effective preventative measures. So the absence of access right now, we have to look at the simple fact that more people die from not having the available treatment. So resistance is a secondary concern if you can't get treated at all in the first place. And we have to recognize that as a simple fact. And we have to tackle that issue. And why is that issue important? Of course, it is important not only in terms of treating those individual patients, but it comes back to the overall burden of disease and the transmission of the disease through communities. So really, really important that we address in parallel these issues, the inequities that result from lack of access. But the environmental dimension is very important here as well. What we see is, of course, that the emergence of resistance it does seem to come from these natural elements that are out in the environment or are selected for in the way that we use these drugs. And then there's some passing back and forward between different kinds of pathogens as well as different niches in different places, this resistance. And we have to do much more, first of all, to understand what are these routes of transmission, but then what are the things that we can do to prevent that transmission happening? So the prevention of infection needs to be a primary goal, and then protecting people and animals in their health is the thing that you do when you find that an infection exists. But this environmental dimension needs to be brought in to be more of a coordinated piece as we look across not only infection prevention control measures in the hospital, the healthcare setting, but homes and more broadly. So very much forgotten. What's the importance of WASH to this? It would be huge. We know if you do a retrospective analysis on the burden of infectious diseases in humans, the greatest gains that were ever achieved were a result of sanitation. That was 85% of the gains in reducing the burdens. Antibiotics cleaned up the tail of that. We need to make sure that access to clean water and effective sanitation is accelerated to help reduce the burden that comes through on that side.
brilliant. Sahi, do you want to add?
Well, yeah, I agree. I mean, all of these areas, there are somewhere policymakers that have to take the decisions, propose necessary policy, pass the laws, adopt the government procedures, and so on and so forth. Basically, what it boils down to is we have to be healthy in order to be resistant to the infection. So our immune system has to be good and resistant. So it's not only the vaccination, but our nature has to do its job, which means that we have to live a healthy life, eat healthy food, work on our environments. And one of the reports I'm working right now also for the Council of Europe is on air pollution. And if you look what air pollution is doing to us in our bodies, how it makes us open to all kinds of diseases, you would not be surprised why we have these issues. But also on the national level, and this is where we as the caucus, working with the parliamentarians in individual countries, we should change that situation where doctors actually prescribing antibiotics to when you're sneezing or when you just have a first cough, very not really problematic, which you don't even have to take drugs because they don't want to take chances. And I think Norway here in Europe is one country which is trying to look deep into the practices. During my fact-finding mission, I was able to look into the system they put in place with special antimicrobial resistance resistant training units where they actually work with the family doctors at the first line level and trying to train them, to teach them not to prescribe those very heavy sometimes antibiotics on small problems. Use penicillin. This is, we're all starting to forget about that, but penicillin is not creating drug resistance, for example, and it still can treat a lot of these infectious diseases. Not, of course, the drug-resistant tuberculosis, for which we have to be prepared. We have to provide proper treatment, have drugs available, proper antibiotics, for which we need to mobilize money for the research and development. So that would be my position there.
Well, I warned the panel that I was going to be a dreadful moderator because I can't keep out of getting involved in the conversation myself, and I do have to do a little bit of advertising for OECD's work on this, because we did a big report earlier this year looking at, actually last year now, I keep forgetting what year we're in, looking at what can be done in the human health sector. And what we found was that a tiny amount of money, if invested in the right sort of things, like promoting hand washing in hospitals, like cleaning hospital rooms properly, like doing things like delayed prescribing. So instead of getting an antibiotic prescription and immediately you can actually get the antibiotic and start taking it, it's delayed, so you have to wait for a certain period of time just to see if you get better without having to take antibiotics. Those sorts of things, maybe about $2 per person per year, could prevent about 70% of the deaths that are currently happening in OECD countries. So we're not talking about vast amounts of money being required to reduce deaths at present, if we can just actually take advantage of all the things that we know already work, but we just don't do properly. Advertising bit finished. Another question from the audience, please.
Thank you. Does it work? Okay, so Herman Garden, I work at the OECD as well. And so years ago, I was at the WHO and at Novartis Vaccines, and we worked on cell-based production of influenza vaccine. And I was just wondering, how far are we now with are we getting more or faster response to any health issue like Ebola outbreaks, etc.? Are we getting faster for the production on demand of vaccines? And my second question would be as well, how much is the supply chain an issue because we are speaking about complicated and complex molecules here, right? So do we have any issues in the supply chain, even in OECD countries, not even speaking of Africa?
Big issues, so be short.
Yeah, I think the vaccine question, I want to make sure everyone understands the importance of CEPI, which is the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, and is a private-public partnership that Wellcome Trust and several governments and Bill and Melinda Gates and private sector partners have contributed money to fund basic research for infections of outbreak and or pandemic relevance, which are also market failures, and Ebola being a great example of that. So CEPI is now funding the development of vaccines that would progress to the stage where they could be put in the freezer, and then if one of these dreaded diseases like Ebola or Marburg arises, they can be put to use. We learned in Ebola how important that was. So the Ebola vaccines, one is being used now, the Merck experimental Ebola vaccine, and the J&J vaccine, which is also experimental, will soon, I hope, be also used in the DRC. But the idea is to have those vaccines in the freezer so you don't have to wait until there are 29,000 people. You can get the vaccine out ahead of the epi curve. That CEPI phenomenon has more than $700 million now, I believe. They've done tranches of funding, and we want to keep growing that because that is part of the solution to these unusual infectious diseases that are usually the biggest problem in the most resource limited areas.
Great. Any more questions out there in the audience? Otherwise, I'm going to go back to the panel and ask what is a mixture of a self-interested question and a question of much, much wider interest.
Well, before the next
Tim,
question,
Tim
though,
wants to come back.
I do want to say one thing about the stability of supplies. And what we have seen, and this is applied into vaccines in some ways, but even antibiotics now, there is fragility in the supply chains for antibiotics. And we've had recent supply shortages in Europe and in the US when there was a fire in a factory in China. The supply chains are probably not sufficient for our needs now. And there are certainly cases where if there is anything that goes wrong, it will impact on the availability of our current drugs that we will want to use. So this is one of these other problems that we need to be very mindful of. It's not just the case that we want to invent great, wonderful things and say, wow, there's the new thing. But we have to think about the end-to-end picture here, which is we want something that's available in the hands of healthcare professionals when it's needed. And so there's a lot more to be considered here. Those supply chains are very important too.
Maybe also a quick comment. I would really like to see some of the companies, like, for example, Johnson & Johnson and Janssen and Otsuka, to be more flexible, prioritizing the patient's life rather than the contracts with their dealers or distributors. We had recently had a case with bedaquiline and delamanid not being able to get registered in the Ukrainian market because the distributor was based in Russia. And due to the conflict, there is the war with Russia. The Ukrainian government was bent to make any procurement, any transfers of public money to any Russian company. It took us months, more than 8 months, to get that sorted out. And all this communication with the company, because they have their own regulations, their contractual obligations, sort of things. But at the end, the ordinary people, the patients, had to wait and suffer because of that. And as far as the vaccines for TB, as far as I know, there are 11 currently being in clinical tests under research, but so far there is not a single efficient, effective vaccine for preventing TB.
And certainly this issue of the fragility of the supply chain goes way beyond antibiotics, of course. I mean, basically far too many of our necessary drugs are being made in single factories around the world, which makes us incredibly vulnerable to something going wrong in that factory or in that production process. So way beyond antimicrobial resistance. Let me come back to the question I was going to ask, which was, I spent the last 2 years of my life attending lots of meetings of something called this Interagency Coordination Group, which was set up by the UN Secretary General to write him a report on what should happen next to tackle drug-resistant infections. And lots of different agencies involved, and we came up with a report earlier this year that we've given to the Secretary General, who's now considering it. What I'd really like to know is what you think of this report. Does it map out the way forward? What's it missing? Are there things that you would have liked to see that you didn't see in that report? And how should we move forward now that we have the report in order to implement some of the things that are suggested? I don't know who wants to start this. I won't be offended instantly.
I'll pick up. So it is really very good news that we have the report and the recommendations back to the Secretary General. And we certainly do hope that the Secretary General takes it back to the UN and also more broadly to member states to identify where actions can occur from that. You know, the fact is this is the starting point for what can be done next. It is not the end point for the UN process, which I fear is one of the things that has happened along the way here. So one of the criticisms I would have is that the process became the end point in the minds of some, and that's unfortunate. But in terms of the recommendations themselves, overall, the recommendations are good. There are no surprises, which indeed is a good thing here because many decades of thought have gone into what are the necessary actions that we would like to see. Given it's a high-level document, of course, it's not a complete roadmap. It doesn't spell out exactly how we would go to achieve these things, but it does set out an appropriate list of objectives to be pursued. An area where I think there should be a stronger approach to it relates to how do we achieve an international coordinated response. And that was something that offered some fairly generic suggestions of ways to go about things, but avoided some of the very sticky politics of today where multilateralism is a dirty word.
Yep. Absolutely recognize those issues. Sahi, Julie, anything to add?
Well, yeah, I would overall agree. We at the Global TB Caucus, who are trying to trigger that international cross-border action based on all these reports and also on the high-level meeting political declaration, we are actually critical right now in trying to translate that political declaration into specific national action plans and transfer that action plans to the national context and make sure the governments actually know what are specific targets that they have to meet in terms of funding, in terms of people that have to be diagnosed as far as TB is concerned, or the people that have to be covered. There are 30% of people with TB and drug-resistant TB which are not even diagnosed or not going through the treatment. We would like to see more in that report, actually, specific recommendation to the parliamentarians. To the parliamentarian networks like ours. I know there are a couple of others like ours. We are the biggest one, the oldest one, the most active one. We want to have specific tools in our hand and arguments that we can use both cross-border and the regional level, but also in our national context, working with the governments and tackling all these specific problems.
Julie, do you want to?
Just to add, I think sometimes the process of creating these high-level reports is as valuable as the report because it brings a very wise crowd of people to come together. There's a lot of networking, connectivity, learning, and opportunities to follow on with different kinds of collaboration. Having said that, I also, especially when I was in the government and had many high-level reports to contend with, that we don't want to get into a situation where we have dueling reports and we have a need for coherent action on AIDS, on malaria, on tuberculosis, on antimicrobial resistance, on market failures in vaccinology and outbreaks like Ebola. So if we dilute the effort by coming at this from too many directions at once, governments and stakeholders who have to create operational plans get confused and they can't concentrate on the priorities. I think that's especially true in the countries that have the least bandwidth and the fewest resources. The last point is the obvious one. Reports are great, but investment is necessary.
One of the things that we came up with in the report was to set up something a bit like the IPCC in climate change, the Independent Panel on Climate Change, which is seen, I think, by most actors, most governments, interested companies in the climate change area, seen as impartial evidence and definitive evidence. I mean, evidence that you can really trust. And what we've suggested is to set up something similar for antimicrobial resistance, and that's partly to give a focus for civil society to be able to campaign on, to say, this is the real evidence we can move forward, and for companies to say, this is the priorities that need to be tackled. Do you think it's feasible? It is, to some extent, the one thing where we went away from what you could be feasible to be a little bit more blue sky in our thinking about coming up with something. Any views on that?
I do think it's feasible. However, it does require strong leadership amongst a few countries to stand behind the idea and push it forward. It's really important, and being a little bit of a pedant here, the IPCC is not independent, functionally independent, but is the intergovernmental panel. And I actually think it's important, though, that you and the ICG's recommendations focused on the independence here. It's not that we need another intergovernmental activity or agency per se, but what we do need is independent of evidence that's available transparently internationally. And so that little bit of nuance is very, very important here. But the access to the good evidence, the best possible evidence, is really important. And that's something that from Wellcome Trust perspective is a priority in what we're wanting to achieve and what we do, but we would very much want to see this happen and to have true political engagement, that there are additional structures and systems brought together to make it available, particularly for those countries that don't have the capabilities.
Yeah, I think also it's feasible if not only the governments are present there. Yeah. We would like to be there too, parliamentarians, particularly the ones who represent national caucuses in the national contexts that could bring a lot of value from not only the parliamentarian, the policy level, but also from different stakeholders that we work within those caucuses. And if civil society is there too, which is quite vibrant, quite active, and particularly the patients, the former patients, the ones who went through, because a lot of, if you talk about TB, a lot about tackling the drug-resistant TB is related to the extensive changes which are needed in the healthcare system, institutional reform, and they are the ones that can bring that knowledge, experience that they lived through that, and get everyone inspired and be able to also keep people accountable, the ones who have this obligation to allocate funding to make sure the reforms are in place and proper medication is also being procured.
Very good. We are down to the last 9 minutes of the panel. So what I'd like to do is ask each of you to say one thing that you at your organization should be doing, can do, in order to tackle drug-resistant infections. One thing that you'd like to see another member of the panel do, whether they're doing it or not already, up to you. And one thing you'd like to see OECD do in our own work. Does that make sense? You with me? Who wants to start?
I can start. In fact, the first question we already done, I would say. We had a great lunch today with between the Global TB Caucus and the OECD Parliamentary Network. There is such a network with OECD, and we had great consultations. Hopefully we can bring our network and organize certain events individually with the member of parliaments within that network. On the other question, of course, and that relating to the event we had yesterday in Geneva, we would like to have the private sector to be more vibrant and also have more creative financial instruments to trigger that incentive for the private sector to invest in more drugs and better drugs. And on the third point, with OECD, I think we are also pretty much set for October. There is an event planned by the OECD Parliamentary Network. So we are proposing to organize a special panel or have a joint event with OECD on public health issue, particularly the antimicrobial resistance and drug-resistant tuberculosis.
Fantastic. Tim?
Well, it's unfortunate that you narrowed it down, and my Christmas list is going to have to be too short here. But your Wellcome Trust has already prioritized this as an issue, but Wellcome Trust can't do enough. So if I were to say one thing more beyond what we're already trying to do here, is I would like to see that we can work as a coordinating partner to help bring together all of the stakeholders so that we can have a comprehensive, coordinated global response to this. So that's my one for us. Now, in terms of my fellow panelists, I have to pick one. So I'm going to lean toward the political side because I actually think that we have not had sufficient political engagement. While we've had brave, bold individuals who stand up and say, we need to do something here and talk about ideas of what should be done, frankly, governments are not really taking things seriously enough, governments as a whole. It's too much reliant upon dedicated individuals. It has to be much, much more serious across governments. And then in terms of the OECD, I certainly do applaud the work that OECD has already done. The report last year was fantastic to see, disappointing that it wasn't picked up and acted upon more fervently, but maybe there's a lesson in that for us. But I would like to see OECD looking at embedding in its analysis on the Sustainable Development Goals how we can look at progress against things like AMR and drug-resistant infections to inform progress on the Sustainable Development Goals.
Judy?
Yeah, thank you. For Merck, known here as MSD, I think we can speed up and accelerate our investment on both the human and the animal health side in our pipeline. We have a certain bandwidth of an investment and focus we can bring, but I think we can do more. And if we can just get proof of concept that there really is value in this, I think we can take advantage of the incredible scientific engine and all the collaborations that we've created across academia and small biotech to really make this a much more visible and urgent priority for our drug development investment. I look again at the parliamentary perspective. You mentioned this, but I would love to see sort of a tiered policy checklist. If you're just starting out, these are the 5 most important things that need to be done at a country level from a policy perspective. And then if you've done that, then these are the next 5, so that we're not overwhelming people with 130 different topics, but we're really focusing on the biggest opportunities to make a true difference. And then I think and I noticed you're not getting any tasks from any of us. From an OECD perspective, I'm thinking about the potential for convening investors who actually invest for impact. And I'm not just talking about impact bonds or, sort of the NGO type investment or the CSR investment. I'm talking about serious investors who need to be convinced that this is a return from putting money into things like AMR and really solving these infectious disease problems, to make the serious economic argument, because there are trillions of dollars in that kind of investment going out there right now, and we need to get their attention focused on areas that are really important to global security. And that's conventional investors, but it's also family investors and even some sovereign investors that are looking for not necessarily maximum return on investment, but a fair return, because they want to feel like they're contributing something of value.
Very good. And I will just add my own element on a version on this. I mean, the first thing to say is, from the point of view of OECD, what we will be doing in the relatively near future is some of that work I talked about, what would be most cost-effective measures that you can take in the human health sector in order to reduce drug-resistant infection. We'll be carrying some of that work over into the agricultural sector to look at where is the biggest possibilities for gains. What would be the effect if we did reduce the amount of antibiotic use in the agricultural sector on the market, so that can we actually reassure countries that they're not going to destroy their agricultural sector if they start actually having better stewardship for the use of antibiotics. And there are some great examples out there. So we'll be doing that work is in the short term. In the more medium term, I think this issue that you just raised, and to some extent you, Tim, is absolutely right. This is an area where we all have agreed that in terms of incentives for developing new medicines, we're not quite there yet. We kind of know what the problems are, but we don't actually have a working model out there. And yet the interest is so obviously clear. You are right in terms of engaged investors looking for a way to actually get involved in this if we can find the right sort of instrument. I don't think the OECD alone is going to be doing that. I think this is something where you, Tim, you are certainly in the pharmaceutical companies, and of course the politicians will have to be involved. And somehow you can see that it must be possible to find the way forward. We just haven't actually managed to find the route map yet for doing it. And it will need some compromises in this. I think it will need some compromises in the way that the pharmaceutical sector interacts with government, the sort of information it gives to government. I think it will need some compromises from the government side about not having total control over the funds and accepting that the private sector will operate for profit. And it has to be acknowledged and allowed to make a profit, and it can't just be turned into some sort of cost plus approach. There must be some scope for some compromise there, and it's something that we'll continue to push for. And that has successfully taken us up to the end of this session. So thank you very much for staying to the end. The closing ceremony is going on starting in a couple of minutes in the main plenary hall. That's Amphitheatre 1, I believe. Is that right? Somebody's going to tell me if it is the case. I hope it's right, because I've just told you that. Thank you very much for coming, and I hope you'll join me in, yes, thanking the panel for their contribution.